so this morning we have Dr. Keiron Audain. He's from the School of Biological Sciences, Department of Food Science and Nutritional Sciences at the University of Ghana, right? And he agreed to give you guys a talk, on farming systems and nutrition sensitivity. It's something a little different, right? I think you should listen to it because he goes over a lot of what we already did in sustainable ag, but he's more looking at it in terms of nutrition base, which is also part of agriculture, because you don't want to grow food that's not nutritious, right? So I hand over to Keiron. You hear me?
Thanks, Adam. Yes, I can hear you.
You good?
Okay, so hi guys. Like Adam mentioned, my name is Keiron Audain. It's a pleasure to be with you guys this morning or this afternoon on my end. So myself, I am a nutrition, agriculture, and health research consultant. So prior to being in Ghana, where I am now, I was working in Zambia, which is in Southern Africa. This is what I'm going to discuss with you guys today. So Adam is a longtime friend and colleague of mine. So I was delighted when he asked me to come and share some of my experiences with you guys about the agricultural space here in Sub-Saharan Africa. So what I'm going to present to you now, it's some data from the Luapula province in Zambia. This data, I collected it for a capacity needs assessment that I did for the GIZ, which is a German development agency. Okay, so can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so this here is a map of Zambia. So the Luapula province, let me just highlight it here. It's in the northern part of the country, and it shares a border with the Democratic Republic of Congo. This border is quite crucial for trade. It's a very important source of income for many farmers in this region. They sell the vast majority of their produce over to the DRC. Luapula province is also very rich in mineral wealth. So it's got a lot of manganese as well as diamonds, but the manganese mining is a lot more pronounced. So I'm showing you this map here to further highlight the fact that the country is set up, it's separated based on agroecological regions. So you have 3 regions, 1, 2, and 3. So Luapula lies in the 3rd region, which is the region that receives the highest amount of rainfall in the country, well over 1,000, up to 1,500 millimeters per annum. It also has the longest growing season as well, between 150 to 190 days. In addition to this, it also has the largest number of water bodies in the country, so including lakes, streams, rivers, waterfalls. So technically speaking, it should be doing really well when it comes to agriculture and nutrition, you would think. But unfortunately, the opposite is actually true. So I'm going to highlight a few demographic information here on the province. So from a socioeconomic perspective, the province is not doing well at all. It has a very low life expectancy, the lowest in the country, about 45 years. Also, the overwhelming majority of the population live below the poverty line, which is earning less than $1.25 a day. It's about 81%. They also have the least number of households raising cattle. So cattle is very important within the African agricultural space because it's used for animal plowing. So in terms of preparing the land. So most of the land that is cultivated in Luapula is cultivated by hand, which is very labor intensive. Also, maize is a major cash crop across Southern Africa. So Luapula actually grows the least amount of maize, least number of households growing maize, compared to the rest of the country. And despite all the water bodies and the rainfall that's available, they also have the lowest percentage of irrigated plots in the country. Right, so this is just a highlight of what the current situation is like. And this actually extends to health indicators as well, specifically child health and nutrition indicators. So throughout the country, Liverpool has the highest prevalence of child malnutrition. So that includes wasting as well as stunting and overweight. So the national prevalence of stunting in the country is about 35%. Liverpool surpasses that at 45%. They also have highest prevalence of anemic children, as well as the least vaccination coverage. So the province, despite all of its potential, it's not doing well at all in terms of agriculture and health. Okay, so these are some photos that I took my last visit there. So just to highlight a few of the farming practices that the farmers engage in. So very, very common is shifting cultivation. I'm not sure if you've ever come across this. It's essentially a slash and burn technique where a plot of land is cultivated for a period of time. And then once the soil is exhausted, they burn the plot and they move on to another plot. So it's both land and labor intensive, and it's perceived to be not very sustainable at all. Another practice is called ridge making. So this is an example you can see here in the photo. It's basically just creating a soil wall to protect the crops. I'll talk a bit more about these two in later slides. And also hand-hoe cultivation as well, which is what the majority of farmers use. So there's little to no mechanization in terms of farming. So it's very, very traditional, very small scale, and that obviously affects yield and income as well as a result. Right, so this is an example here of ridge making. So it's typically done using machinery, but can also be done by hand as well. So it's very common. Close to 40% of farmers practice hand ridge making. So the purpose of this is to improve flood control capacity as well as drainage of the soil itself. Right, so when there are problems with uneven water distribution after rainfall, this practice can help mitigate some of that. But as I said, it's extremely labor intensive. So shifting cultivation, as I mentioned, this is where the land is temporarily cultivated, then abandoned. But the premise of this, because this is a practice that is very old, probably as old as agriculture practices itself. So the premise is to allow for the land to rejuvenate itself, right? So when it's left alone, it should allow for post-disturbance fallow vegetation. So using this idea, it should be beneficial to communities if it's well managed. The problem occurs as a result of the fact that it's not left long enough for it to rejuvenate, right? The fallow periods are usually too short and the cultivation time is too long. So as a result, when farmers go back to the plot, you find that the soil is still way too acidic and it actually affects the yields. But if done properly, if left to rejuvenate for a longer period of time, it can actually be quite beneficial in terms of providing a very rich and diverse harvest. So using one plot of land, you can actually cultivate up to 40 crops simultaneously around, like throughout the year, because different crops have different growing periods. And that can vastly improve food availability as well as dietary diversity. But as I mentioned, the restorative period needs to be long enough for the plot of land to properly rejuvenate. And it's not necessarily expected to get too much of a yield of one particular crop because it's, as I say, you're growing multiple crops. So once you don't have a too high of an expectation of yield and there's a long enough restoration period, this can actually be a sustainable method. Unfortunately, that's not usually the case. So you find that you have many different plots of land that are not suitable for growing crops because of the acidity of the soil. Okay, so now I want to talk a bit about some of the major crops that are grown in this region. So the region itself, the province, is known for its cassava. Cassava is the number one crop grown in Luapula. It's primarily used for consumption, so they consume both the root and the leaves. This is followed by maize and also groundnuts and Bambara nuts. Now, Luapula actually grows the most amount of Bambara nuts. Bambara nuts is an indigenous legume that is not as popular outside of the region, but is extremely nutritious, extremely climate resilient. I have a slide on Bambara nuts. I'll talk a bit about that as well. But these are some of the major crops that are grown. Cassava is considered a subsistence crop, so it doesn't necessarily make it to market, apart from a few industry players that purchase cassava for beer production. So the two districts that I worked in, Mwense as well as Kawambwa, these are some of the crops that are typically grown here. So with time and with training, there have been a lot of crops have been introduced to the region as a way to promote crop diversity. So things like sweet potatoes, soybeans, tomatoes, sugarcane, pineapples. These are grown on a rotation basis, as well as the other typical cash crops. So the average yield of each farmer is primarily dependent on the size of the plot that they're cultivating, as well as the fertility of the soil. So on average for maize, we get about 40 to 50 bags, which almost all of it goes to the market. Then about 60 bags of cassava, primarily for consumption, and then 10 bags of groundnuts, which also goes to the market. So when I say market, I mean either the national market, which it goes to the main cities of Lusaka, a few other main cities, or for cross-border trading with the Democratic Republic of Congo. So these are some pictures that I took of the cassava plots. As you can see, they're quite extensive. Yeah, cassava is also quite a nutritious crop as well. Okay, so landholding size. So this, as I mentioned, is a key determinant of yield. So the typical definition of a smallholder farmer, as you may already know, is one that cultivates less than 2 hectares of land. So the overwhelming majority of farmers in sub-Saharan Africa fall under this category in terms of them being smallholder farmers. Also, the majority of these farmers, like I said, they cultivate by hand, right? So that is a major determining factor of yield as well. And also the distance that the farmers have to travel to get to from their homesteads to the fields. So in the rest of the country, the average distance is about 2.9 kilometers, whereas in Luapula, it's 6.2 kilometers. And this doesn't sound like a far distance, but when you look at the actual terrain of the country itself in terms of road networks, it's not always easy to get to these plots. So it takes a considerable amount of time. Most farmers either go by foot or by bicycle. And there are some that actually camp especially during the planting season, they would build a small camp and actually camp on the land itself. Strangely enough, these farmers that are known for camping also known for experiencing higher levels of both individual as well as household food insecurity. Okay, so looking at some commonly consumed foods. So this image here, this white lump here, this is called shima. It's typically made from maize, but it could also be made from cassava as well as other grains like sorghum and millet. Very, very common in Southern Africa. It's called by different names: pap in South Africa, sadza in Zimbabwe, but it's typical. This here is a typical Southern African diet. So different types of veggies, protein source, whether it's fish or chicken, village chicken, as well as white maize. And they also consume a lot of beans as well as sweet potatoes, and then avocados and mangoes when they are in season. Luapula is known for its mangoes. They have lots and lots of mangoes. The sad thing is that most of it goes to waste. And that is very unfortunate considering that the country in general and the region specifically, they have a serious problem with vitamin A deficiency. Considering how rich mangoes are in vitamin A, it's a shame that most of it goes to waste. And the country has to rely on vitamin A supplementation for young children. Okay, so most farmers throughout the country, they access what is called the Farmer Input Subsidy Program, or FISP. So this is a government initiative, right? Whereby farmers receive subsidized fertilizers and other types of inputs like seeds, for example. This is primarily directed towards the maize growers because maize is the key cash crop in Zambia. So most of the inputs that they receive from the government are maize related. So they get the urea fertilizer as well as the hybrid seeds. And it works via e-voucher system where the government provides vouchers and then the farmers take it to these agro dealers like you see in the photo here, and then they purchase the necessary fertilizers or the necessary inputs. Luapula actually has the second highest fertilizer application rate in the country. So the national average is about 155 kilograms per hectare. Luapula averages at about 177, but that's still lower than the recommended blanket rate of 200 kilograms per hectare. Okay, so a few other inputs that are available, right? So you have your different types of seeds for your vegetables, different chemicals, as well as animal feed, primarily chicken feed, but also pig feed as well. And so, like I said, there's mainly the maize inputs that are available on the FISP program, and then the others you can get from the agro dealers. Now, these inputs are not cheap in any way, shape, or form. So how farmers get around the costs, they either pool their resources together, so they form cooperatives or farmers unions, and they purchase the inputs in bulk and share it amongst themselves. Also, in some cases, the agro dealers themselves, they repackage the inputs into smaller quantities. So, for example, a 200 ml bottle, they would separate it, divide it into like 50 ml, and then they would sell it at a cheaper price. Right, so where there's a will, there's always a way. So these are some photos of some of the inputs available. You can see some of the prices there. These prices are in Zambian kwacha. So $1 is roughly right now, it's roughly about 18 Zambian kwacha. These are some of the inputs that are available. Okay, so based on farmer feedback, some of the benefits of the FISP program is that it helps to boost farmer income. So it can actually contribute to increasing the amount of income farmers have available, right, by boosting yield, right? It makes the inputs more affordable, and the overall impact is that it can improve food security, both by increasing food availability as well as income. Unfortunately, the system is not perfect, and farmers regularly complain about the inputs arriving late. So late inputs can actually offset the entire planting season, the entire planting system. So if the inputs arrive late, the planting starts late, and the harvest itself is late, and that affects both food security as well as income as well. Then in some instances, fertilizer may not be sufficient for the entire area that the farmers are cultivating. And then another very important point is the dependency. So very often you find farmers become totally dependent on this system to receive their inputs. So when it's not available for whatever reason, farmers suffer a great deal. Many of them are unable to cultivate that year, right? And then they have to go and work on other farms as a result. Okay, so livestock farming, this is also quite common, although not all of these livestock is reared in this area. So it's primarily village chickens as well as goats. So those are the key livestock that you would find. So we find close to 85% of households rear chickens, and about almost 40% have goats. Pigs is considerably lower, only about 2% of the farmers have pigs, so it's the lowest in the country. Cattle as well is also quite low. So yeah, it's primarily chickens and goats, and almost none of the livestock is actually kept for consumption. Like livestock is the biggest earner, financial earner. So it's almost exclusively taken to the markets. So Mwense itself, Mwense is the town that borders the DRC. So most of the livestock that is reared in that area, almost all of it is sold across the border into the Congo. So they actually call that border area the Bermuda Triangle, because literally everything that they take there, it's sold and it disappears. So unfortunately, because of the situation in Congo, the agricultural sector is not very stable. So they rarely produce anything for themselves, and they have to depend on neighboring countries for literally everything that they consume. So one of the main challenges that farmers face is Newcastle disease, which is a disease that affects broiler chickens, which leads to a very high mortality rate. So this is something that they have requested support for in terms of helping to alleviate this problem to reduce the amount of chickens that they lose. Right, so I mentioned that consumption is very low as well. So this is an idea of what the livestock sector looks like. Right, so in terms of market decisions, farmers are either subsistence farmers in terms of they grow for themselves, but this number is actually very low. There's very few farmers that just can afford to just grow for themselves, right? Most farmers either sell some and save some, so they sell the majority of it, the high earning crops, and they would save some, mainly cassava And then you have the farmers that just sell everything. They sell everything and then they go to the market to buy what they need for themselves and their family. Okay, so the main markets, like I mentioned, cross-border trade, as well as industry. So you find companies like Zambian breweries, which make beer. They purchase a lot of cassava as well as maize from these farmers. And you have your domestic markets as well. All right, so I'll talk a bit about the planting season. So this runs from November to March, which coincides with the beginning of the rainy season. So this also overlaps with the hunger season or hunger period, which is a period just after all the stocks are depleted and just before the harvest actually comes in, right? So that's when you get highest levels of food insecurity, and that leads to a knock-on effect on nutritional status as well. Right, so during this time, the farmers practice various coping strategies. So they mainly rely on food reserves, so cassava, for example, that has been kept over. And for the most part, most of them reduce their food intake, right? So they have meal reductions, they either consume less food or they reduce the frequency of consumption. So they may eat like one meal a day, for example. Another coping strategy is the reliance on wild foods. So as you see in this photo here, these are wild mushrooms that were harvested in the forest. They're very commonly consumed during this time as well. So some of them they roast it, and some of them grill it as well. So it can be consumed like a meat substitute. And then you find other farmers, they go to different provinces, so they may travel further north and sell their labor as well as work for food as well. So these are some of the things that they have to do during this time. Right, so like I mentioned, some of the wild foods that they consume include mushrooms, as well as fruits and other vegetables. And then you have your small creatures, small animals like caterpillars and mice. Caterpillars in this region, they're called mopani worms. And there's actually a huge drive now to commercialize these worms and have them available in supermarkets. So they have some supermarkets that actually sell mopani worms. And it's a bit of a delicacy in this part of the world as well, not just in Zambia, in South Africa, Zimbabwe as well. We consume these mopani worms. They fry it in vegetable oil. It's actually a rich protein source, though I've never tried it myself. So yes, another unfortunate aspect of agriculture in Luapula is the state of the aquaculture sector. It's extremely small scale, right? Despite its huge potential with the amount of water and rainfall this province receives. So the very little aquaculture that does take place, the market is pretty much the same as the capture fisheries, right? So wherever the fishermen sell their produce, the fish farmers will take it to, for the most part, the same areas. In some instances, like in Mwense, for example, there's a lack of access to water. So there's not much water in Mwense, but for the rest of the province, it's mainly a lack of knowledge, specifically with regards to maintenance. There have been some cases where fish ponds have been set up, they receive funding, but then after some time, due to lack of knowledge of how to actually maintain these ponds, most, if not all of the fish end up dying. So that is an unfortunate aspect. So similarly with irrigation, lower polar farmers, they actually have the lowest percentage of irrigated plots. So I think about out of 116,000 hectares available for irrigation, only about 1,000 is actually irrigated. Right. Similarly, they have a low percentage of farming plots found in wetlands. There have been some agencies that have provided training, like JICA, for example, the Japanese International Cooperation Agency. They have provided some training on irrigation in the area in terms of stream diversion, vegetable production, as well as fish farming. So hopefully some of these initiatives can be sustainable and then eventually spread to other parts of the province. Right, so in addition to that, other training that farmers receive, crop production and crop rotation, right, which has led to the introduction of a lot of new crops into the region, so different sources of income for farmers, as well as training on fertilizer application, pest control, and more recently, nutrition. So in terms of, this is part of like a drive to promote nutrition-sensitive agriculture, where extension officers and other volunteers would train farmers on some nutritious crops, as well as indigenous nutritious crops that they can grow, both for their own consumption, as well as for the general market. Also, there have been a lot of information, agriculture-related information that's being disseminated via radio, because there are not many households with access to television. So radio is the main source of information. So these are some of the local radio stations that receive health and agricultural information. So at the moment, I think there's about 16 radio shows that broadcast on the Farmer Notebook program, and they broadcast in all of the local languages, so about 8 different languages, including English. So this is also contributing to improving farmer knowledge and helps with the adoption of better farming practices. Okay, so gender. Now, with regards to the sharing of agricultural duties between men and women, things have significantly improved over the years. There was at one point where all of the responsibilities were down to women, but for the most part now things are shared a bit more, but it's still primarily male dominated. So men are responsible for preparing the land as well as selling the crops. So the beginning and the end. And then women do everything else in between. So that includes things like planting, weeding, harvesting, even applying fertilizer as well, or generally the responsibilities of women. But the inequality itself is most visible when it comes to the money. So men are largely in control of the money. They decide how much the crops sell for within the constraints of the market, of course, and they also decide how the money is spent, right? So you find that a lot of female-headed households, even though the household income would be considerably less, you tend to find that those households prioritize household nutrition and food security. So you tend to find that these female-headed households, the women would more likely spend the money on food and nutritious food for the household. So the children have better nutritional outcomes as a result. Okay, so these are some of the key challenges that not just farmers face, but also the extension officers. So mobility is probably one of the largest challenges for the agricultural extension officers that work in that area. So a lack of access to transport, a lack of vehicles to reach some remote areas, that hinders them from carrying out various activities in terms of, for example, conducting training demonstrations, as well as monitoring the progress of the farmers. They find it very challenging to do this. It's only when you have these agencies and organizations like GIZ that they come in and they provide vehicles, even though it's on a temporary basis, that they're able to conduct these training programs. Then the soil fertility as well. So like I mentioned, following the burning of the land during shifting cultivation, the soil is very acidic. It takes a while for it to get back to its normal pH. So that generally affects the yields of farmers as well. So if they return to the plot too soon, you find that the soil remains very acidic. And then, of course, labor intensivity as well. So you find handhold farming really limits the amount of land that the farmers can cultivate, which limits the amount of yield that they expect. So these are some key challenges that affect the farming situation in that province. Okay, so now that I've discussed a bit of the agriculture, now I want to get to the nutritional aspect of these indigenous crops, the nutritional and climate aspects of these crops. So I'm going to highlight 3 crops, or 4 crops. And what these crops have in common is that they are all highly nutritious, like highly nutritious, an abundance of micronutrients, phytonutrients, macronutrients as well. And they are all very climate resilient, meaning that they grow well under harsh, high temperatures, as well as harsh soil conditions as well. And they all form part of a traditional diet, which has been largely offset due to the impact of the colonial era. So maize is actually not an indigenous crop to Southern Africa. Maize was introduced during the colonial times, and it has surpassed other indigenous grains like millet and sorghum, for example, despite its nutritional inferiority. So white maize in particular lacks vitamin A. So most people that consume a monotonous maize diet are most likely to be vitamin A deficient. So I'm going to look at these 3 crops. So firstly, sorghum. Sorghum is well cultivated globally. It's the 5th most widely produced cereal crop, but the majority of the sorghum produced is used for either livestock feed or ethanol production. And then the remainder is consumed by people in low-income countries. That in itself lends to a stigma that sorghum is what they call poor people's food. So that is another huge problem that many indigenous crops face. They are associated with poverty. So there are many people, especially in the urban areas, that do not want to consume these foods. They rather consume, what is likely available here, highly processed foods. Right, so sorghum is very drought resilient. Like I mentioned, it can survive high temperatures as well as high altitude and toxic soil. And it has a very unique phenolic profile, which lends to its antioxidant properties. And it has been linked to improving gut health as well as reducing cancer risk as well. Okay, similarly, millet. Millet is also widely produced, 6th most widely produced cereal, very rich in phytonutrients, amino acids, as well as micronutrients. Right, there are very different varieties of millet as well. Most commonly, your finger millet, pearl millet, and then your common millet. Those ones are most commonly produced. So this photo here is finger millet. And it has been linked with the reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, as well as hypertension, cardiovascular diseases, ischemic stroke, cancers, as well as celiac disease as well. So millet, both sorghum and millet can be used to make shima. So sorghum, millet, and cassava are your maize alternatives when it comes to making shima. Okay, then you have your amaranth. This one is not just indigenous, but it's also underutilized. So unlike sorghum and millet, which is produced for other purposes, most of the varieties of amaranth are still wild. So there are very few that have been domesticated for consumption. Also highly nutritious. The nutrient content may actually be even higher than maize, wheat, rice, sorghum, all the other grains, all the other cereals. And it also contains seeds. Amaranth seeds also contains squalene, so it's a vegetarian source of squalene. No, squalene is usually sourced from shark liver oil, right? Which is a very unsustainable practice, considering that sharks are an endangered species. So squalene oil has a lot of value, both in the cosmetic industry as well as the pharmaceutical industry. So this is another potential source of income as well for the small scale farmers. All right, so the last crop I wanted to look at is Bambara nuts that I mentioned before. So Luapula is mostly known for this legume here. It's considered to be a complete food, meaning it has complex carbs as well as high levels of plant-based protein, unsaturated fats, as well as minerals. And because it's a legume, it actually adds nitrogen to the soil, which improves soil fertility. And you guys would know all about that. And it's very, very resilient to harsh environments as well. So it can grow in both arid and semi-arid regions. And you can get a decent yield even on poor soil, right? So if soil that has been succumbed to shifting cultivation, for example, you can still get a decent yield of Bambara nuts. All right, so these are some key indigenous crops that can be grown in this region and other regions as well. Okay, so just to summarize and conclude, so I highlighted some typical farming practices that occur, primarily unsustainable farming practices at the moment. So you're shifting cultivation, and then ridge making, which is very useful but very labor intensive, right? So for me, this province highlights the importance of utilizing resources. So you find that not for the life of me can anyone explain to me why this is the case. Some people have said that the farmers have become lazy and too dependent on external support, which is why they don't utilize the resources that are available to them, like all these water bodies, high levels of rainfall. So most farmers just depend on rainfall only. So this is changing considerably because of climate change. You find that the rainfall period, sometimes the rains start too late, sometimes they start too early, sometimes they finish late, sometimes they finish early. So it's very erratic. The rainfall patterns have become extremely erratic in Southern Africa, and most parts of the world as well. But in Southern Africa, it's very unpredictable. So as a result, the farmers are suffering, they're losing yield, and it's extremely problematic. So they need to start utilizing these resources that are available to them. And that includes the indigenous crops, right? Based on their high levels of climate resilience, as well as their nutritional value. And in terms of access to mechanization as well, this is something that can also improve the sustainability of their harvests. So even something as simple as animal plowing. So you find that even though, so a province like Luapula has the lowest levels of animal plowing, I think only about 0.3%. And if you compare that to another part of the country like Southern Province has about 90% of plots utilize animal plowing. Right, so there's a vast disparity within the country itself. Even though Southern Province has its own problems with drought, that part of the country is very, very drought prone. So they deal with their own issues. They don't have as much rainfall as in the northern parts of the country. Okay, so I will end there and open up for any questions. Thank you guys for listening.
Does anybody have any questions?
Over to you.
No questions at all. But we kind of press for time, Keiron, because class open in like 1 minute. So, but I mean, we sure have at least one question. If we don't ask one question, this will come on the final. So let's ask one question. Anybody? Molly said today. That is lucky. Yeah, Molly, what's the question?
So based on all the information around with the Leolupa, am I pronouncing that right?
Luapula, yes.
Is there any type of like I'm trying to think of the word for it.
Sure.
Yeah, since there's a lot of like water involved, so like is that another industry there, or is that another industry that's like a little bit tougher to do there?
Sorry, I didn't get the last part.
So what he's saying is that if aquaculture is since it have a lot of water in Luapula, does aquaculture form like a major industry or form a major part of the agriculture industry?
It has huge potential to be to actually supply the entire country, if not the region, because of the amount of water that's available. The problem is the technical expertise, the technical know-how of the farmers. It's not there. So I think with a little bit more training and trial and error, it can actually get there. But it all depends on the incentives, the farmers' incentives. Are they willing to put in the work and actually train and learn how to maintain these fish ponds? Because the problem is what has happened in the past is maintenance. A lot of them have not been properly maintained, and as a result, they just fell by the wayside. So they can, if despite its potential, it's not known for aquaculture at all. So I think that is something that definitely needs to change.
Do you have any other questions? All right, thank you, Dr. Audain, for spending this time with us to actually teach us a little bit about agriculture in a totally different part of the world. So thank you very much, and I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thank you guys for having me.